So I'm going to do a Q&A sessions. I asked people in my Facebook group for some questions. I got questions about coping with feelings of disconnection and isolation, how to deal with heightened anxiety, how to deal with exhaustion. I did get another question about signs of recovery, and I thought that was a topic that I could explore in more detail, so I will do a live session next week. So let's start with this first question. I'd like to know how to cope with feelings of disconnection and isolation, which make me feel very low. So I did ask this person to clarify, was it an energy issue that they were feeling disconnected and isolated because they didn't have the energy to connect to people? Or is it a network issue, i.e., maybe a person hasn't got as big a network as they may have, because obviously if you've been sick for a long time, maybe you've lost contact with people. There are some people who don't really understand the condition, so don't know how to support you. So I'll talk a little bit about both, because energy and network might be an issue for some people. So I did ask this person for a clarification, and they did say it's primarily a question of energy and sensory overwhelm. A lot of friends have drifted away because I don't have the energy for socialising. And I also can find some conversations very triggering. I do have a couple of very supportive family members. So sorry to hear that's your experience. And if you're watching and you're experiencing a similar thing, then I'm sorry that's your experience as well. So it sounds like, you're saying it is an energy issue. And it also sounds that in part because you've lost friends, there is a network issue. Okay, and it's great that this person has supportive family members. Now, they do say they find some conversations triggering. So I'd want more information about that. I'm going to assume conversations are triggering because people say unhelpful things, but feel free to clarify that. Actually, the person did say they're happy for me to use their first name. So Pam, just let me know if that's the issue, is that people are saying unhelpful things because they don't understand the condition. So what I'd like you to consider is that if it is an energy issue, first thing, I feel for you if you feel disconnected and isolated, because I know that can be painful. So the question I'd really get you to ask yourself is, how can I get some of my needs met for connection? I'd like you to consider that and brainstorm yourself. What ideas can you come up with? Okay. When I do group coaching and people ask a question, I need help with this, I often get them to think about solutions for themselves and the other people in the group to share their suggestions, as long as the person I'm chatting to is happy with that. But the first thing I'd say is, look, if you were to wave a magic wand and negotiate your needs, then what requests would you make? To give you an example of that, there was a time when I had ME/CFS that I just couldn't actually talk when I was resting. I was just so exhausted. I just didn't have the energy to have a conversation. And sometimes, at one point I was staying with my parents and my mum would come into the room and I had to say, look, at the moment, I just can't talk. But what would be really helpful is if you were to just sit with me for a while. I can't remember if she held my hand. She might have done. Can't remember. And when I remembered that today, I kind of felt quite emotional, because I just remember that my mum was willing to listen to my needs and respond. She was a nurse, so she had those skills. But that can be a challenge for some people. And therefore, it's really important that we make clear requests, okay? Because sometimes I've had the experience where I'm kind of assuming someone knows what I want, and actually I need to be really clear. There's a story that Jack Canfield tells where he asked his wife to come into the basement where he'd been doing some tidying up and tell him what a good job he'd done. He said, I felt like a kid. But actually, what I realise is that we want certain things from people, but they don't always know what we want, and we don't always communicate it clearly, all right? So that's the first thing, is to consider, can I negotiate my needs? You know, another thing in terms of boundaries, in terms of being triggered by other people, one of the other things I said to my mum is, look, it's really helpful if you just say to me, can I make a suggestion, or can I ask a question? Because if it's done in that way, then I'm more receptive, as opposed to someone just saying to me, oh, I think you should do this. That would kind of trigger me. But if I made that request and my mum said, is it okay if I ask you a question, or can I make a suggestion? Somehow it was like I was ready to receive. Okay, does that make sense? Let me know in the chat if you can see that difference between someone offering uninvited advice to getting permission first. The next thing I'd suggest is that, aligned to what I've just been talking about, is that you establish some guidelines. So I've just given you one example. There's a woman called Jenny who, in my group, I've posted some guidelines in my Facebook group, CFS Explored. I've posted her guidelines for visitors. And I think her suggestions are really helpful. So if you are in my Facebook group, CFS Explored, then do check those out. If you're not in my group, then pop a comment in the chat if you want the link to the group, and I will post the link below this video if you're watching on another platform. So think about, what guidelines do you need to establish so that you're not being triggered by people who are often kind of are feeling uncomfortable, and that's why they say things that aren't that helpful. There may be people who say things because maybe they are antagonistic, and you might need to set some guidelines with certain people. Okay. If the issue is more of a network issue, what are the things you could do to create a bit of connection, to find your tribe? I think it's really important that we find our tribe, a group of people who are like-minded, who are on the same journey, and who have more sensitivity to your needs. Now, I was a member of a CFS group, a local group, and I would suggest that there were some people who did have certain sensitivities to my needs, and there were other people who didn't, and therefore I gravitated towards the people who did. All right, so for example, I had one friend who was, if we arranged to meet, he was always late. And so I had to say to him, look, if we agree to meet a certain time, I'm going to be there for about an hour and a half. And if we arrange to meet at 7 o'clock and we've agreed that, if you come at 8:15, you're going to have 15 minutes of me. And so he started turning up on time. All right. But consider that. So could you join an online meditation class? I realize it's not necessarily the same as connecting in person, but I've joined online groups, especially in COVID, and there's still a couple of online groups that I'm involved with. And after a while, I forget that we're not there in person. And it does feel like we're making a connection. Okay, so consider that. Are there online groups that you could join to just get that sense of connection? Next thing, could you create a group? I'm very aware that there are a lot of people who are feeling isolated. And I think it's a great shame that someone isn't the catalyst for creating a group, a support group. When I train people, when people do my group program, I encourage them to meet as a peer group and work together. And because that's one of the ways that we learn from teaching to others. And so far, the groups that I've encouraged people to start up, the feedback I've got is really positive. They really like being in that environment where they're helping each other. And if you've seen the film Patch Adams, which is a true story about a doctor who realised when he was in psychiatric hospital that by helping other people, it made him feel better about himself. Okay, so consider that. Could you be the catalyst for either creating a buddy network? So you might just have one person who you meet up with regularly, could be weekly, fortnightly, whatever works for you. I have a weekly conversation at the beginning of each week with someone. We spend about 15 minutes just talking about our goals for the week, reviewing the last week, and it's a really useful exercise because it forces me to sit down and plan my week. Okay, so there is a power of being in a group. So is that something you could start? Are there some people you already have some kind of connection to, and you might invite them, say, hey, would you be interested in, you know, creating a group where we meet regularly? And it can be really small. Some of the groups from my Building Resilience training are 3 people, but they still find it super valuable. Okay. And if you do create a group, you might need to think about the guidelines for the group. In my resilience coaching, there are guidelines so people know what's helpful and what is not helpful. So I'd say to people, don't give advice unless it's asked for, but it's okay for you to speak in the first person. What I take from this is X. This is what I'm going to put into action based on this conversation. And if you want access to guidelines, they're very short, but I'm happy to share them with anyone. So the next tip is having a pet. Have you got a pet? Would it be something that you can consider? So, for instance, I recall when I was cat sitting for my daughter, they were away on a school trip and I was cat sitting, and I never felt lonely when I was at the house because there was this cat who wasn't the most affectionate cat, but just being in the presence of the cat gave me some sense of connection and, you know, the capacity to care for another live being, it being an animal. Okay, so just consider that. Is that something that would help? I know that's not necessarily a fit for everybody. The next tip is a bit left field, but one of the things I've noticed is that when I'm in the house and I have a friend staying with me and she's in the house, maybe in the next room, I have a feeling of connection. Now, what's interesting is when she's not in the house, there might be times when, you know, she's actually away at the moment on holiday, but actually I don't feel those feelings of loneliness that I used to feel. But also I kind of play this game in my head where I think, well, actually, if I think about it, I'm sitting in my room and she was in the room next door. I've got neighbours on the other side of the wall. They're not in the same house, but we are separated by one wall. And when I think about it in that way, I kind of feel a sense of connection. And actually, sometimes, this is my next tip, I do a visualization around feeling connected. So I might be on my own in the house, but I'll close my eyes and I'll just visualize the people around me, the neighbours in my street who I like. I'll think about that person over there and that person across the road, that person on that side, and even the people at the back who I'm friendly with. And I might think of other people who are special to me, family, friends, and it just gives me a sense of connection. Final tip on this is, what can you do to just connect to someone, even if it's just sending them a text, sending them a message. There are times when I felt at my lowest when I had ME/CFS. There was one person in particular who I knew was kind of struggling more than me. And so I'd kind of remind myself when I was feeling really low and feeling pretty despondent, I'd think of her and I'd either give her a call or I'd send her a message. And we might just have a brief call. I'd say, look, I can only chat for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and then I need to go. But I just wanted to reach out. And She appreciated that, and I just got some good feelings from doing that. So if you've got any tips for Pam or anyone else, then feel free to pop them in the chat, whether you were watching live or watching the replay. And I'll pause there. Let me know what your takeaway is from the conversation so far, and I'll move on to the next question.